Welcome back. We actually have one more video and set of PowerPoints to cover the Apostolic Fathers. But before we get to that, I wanted to insert at this point a couple of short videos. Well, this one will be short. The next one might be slightly longer. That cover that consider the heresies that these early church fathers had to contend with. And so for this particular lecture, we're going to be looking at the heresy of Ebionism, and in the next lecture, we'll be looking at the much more serious and extensive problem of Gnosticism. And so let me get right to it. In order to keep this particular video short, we're going to consider the heresy of Ebionism. Now, Ebionism actually comes from the Jewish heritage. And through these PowerPoints, please be noticing the questions, because that's how we're going to advance things. So we want to start with the when. The Ebionite movement may have arisen about the time of the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD. There were a number of small Jewish sects, S-E-T-C-S, that were prevalent, existent, I should say, during the time of the first century. And many people considered Christianity to be one of these. The Ebionite movement, we think, was probably another one of those different sects, those small groupings of people. Its members, like a lot of these groups at this time of turmoil, would have left Palestine in order to avoid persecution. Some of the Ebionites would have gone to Transjordan, most notably Pella, and that's a very famous place, a rock formation there that has the outlines of a temple carved right into the rock. Other places they went to, Syria, and then they kept expanding, and they moved to Asia Minor and Egypt. And this sect actually seems to have existed into the 4th century, so it was, while small, certainly not necessarily a minor group of people. The Ebionites, you might think, and even some of the early church fathers thought, that they derive their name from an individual named Ebion. And it's unlikely, however, that there was one individual named Ebion. More than likely, this was a term that comes from the Hebrew term Ebion, which means poor ones, and actually may be a name that they gave to themselves based on texts like Matthew 5:3 or others in the New Testament. Virtually everything we know about them comes from their opponents, and that's always kind of difficult because we're never really sure if their opponents are giving us a very fair view of their beliefs and of what they taught. But in this particular case, we're going to assume that the church fathers recorded Ebionite beliefs accurately. So they were basically Jewish in background. They had similarities to other groups like the Essenes, the group that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in the Qumran caves around the Dead Sea. And the interesting thing about the Ebionites was that they claimed to be Christian, at least of some form or another, because they did accept Jesus as the Messiah. Now we're going to find out that this Jesus is a very different Jesus than the Gospels and the New Testament portrays him to be, but nevertheless, they did claim that. They were ascetics, that is, they abstained from life's pleasures. They sought a lifestyle of self-denial and even harsh treatment of the body at times. They thought that raised their spiritual level, and many, many people through the centuries have had that same idea, wrong idea, but nevertheless, it's one that's very old. One author says they were vegetarians. They practiced various forms of ritual ablutions. The term just means washings, culminating in baptism. That's another aspect of a number of these small Jewish sects at the time. Baptism, the various kinds of baptisms, were quite important to them in terms of their spirituality and their belief system. You can imagine then, with their asceticism and their Jewish background, that they were fairly legalistic. And it seems that many of their views were like those of the Judaizers, if you think of those that those Jews that dogged Paul's steps during his ministry, as recorded in the book of Acts. Those people that insisted that Gentiles had to be circumcised, had to become Jews in effect before they could become Christians. Paul had to deal with that in the book of, in his letter to the Galatians. They had a version of Matthew's gospel. They called it the gospel according to the Hebrews, but of course it's not really at all related to the New Testament book of that name. They rejected Paul's writings for obvious reasons. They didn't like Paul's denial of the need for circumcision, but they did accept James' epistles and certain other aspects of parts of the New Testament. Their Christology is the most important part of their doctrine, and frankly, the most wrong, incorrect part of their doctrine. Like other Jewish groups, they looked for the Jewish Messiah. The Ebionites did believe, as I've already said, that Jesus of Nazareth was that Messiah. They referred to him as the true prophet of Deuteronomy 18:15. And Deuteronomy 18:15 is the text where Moses tells the children of Israel that there will come a prophet like him, greater than him, at a future time. And so that was one of the aspects of messianic expectation just before and during the first century, is that they expected a prophet to arise, and that prophet would be the Messiah. And they held that Jesus was that Messiah. Actually, he became that Messiah by obedience to the law. So you can see that they had a very legalistic idea of even how the Messiah could become the Messiah. This is a version of a heresy known as adoptionism. And adoptionism is an aspect of a number of different heresies, but it basically means that the man Jesus was adopted by God. The Father became the Father, and Jesus of Nazareth became his son, in a sense. But they denied that Jesus was deity, and certainly he was not the Son of God, capital S-O-N, of God, as we would understand the title. And as the note there on the side says, adoptionism is the theory that Jesus was in nature only a man, but he was adopted by God. And when he was adopted by God, that is the point at which he became the Logos, or the Son, or a number of other messianic titles are applied at that particular point. So again, just to explain a little further, they held that Jesus was an ordinary, though perhaps unusually holy man, who was born to Mary and Joseph in a normal way. You can see that they rejected the virgin birth. And they taught that Jesus, at his baptism, became the Christ. At that point, the power and presence of God came upon him. So that's the point at which he was adopted. He was adopted, Jesus was adopted as God's son. And that's the point at which the supernatural powers and the other ways of identifying as the Messiah were given to this man, Jesus of Nazareth. When on the cross, Jesus cried out, "Why have you forsaken me?" which was a quotation from Psalm 22, verse 1. The adoptionists, the Ebionites, said that's the point at which the Christ withdrew from the man Jesus. And so they are still waiting for either him to come back in some versions of Ebionism or for the real Messiah to finally show up. There are several versions of Ebionism, really. And it's, again, because we only know of Ebionism from their opponents, sometimes we're not sure at this point exactly what they thought happened after the cross. Well, what did the Orthodox opponents say about the Ebionites? Irenaeus, who we've seen as one of the most important of the fathers to deal with this particular issue. Well, actually, Irenaeus is coming up, so he will be in a future lecture. Irenaeus said, those who are called the Ebionites agree that the world was made by God, so they basically believe in the God of the Old Testament, but their opinions with respect to the Lord are similar to those of Cerinthus and Carpocrates. Over the side, you see the note there. Cerinthianism was a heresy taught by a guy named Cerinthius, in this case, who died at about the year 100. And Cerinthus thought that the person of Christ, again, was adopted. The person of Jesus was adopted by the Christ, and that at his baptism, That's what happened at his baptism, and that he was that the Christ left, or the Messiah left, the Jesus of Nazareth at the crucifixion. Basically, what we've just summarized from the earlier slide. Essentially, Cerinthus taught that the Christ and Jesus are separate beings. So the Ebionites weren't exactly like that, but there were some similarities to that particular point of view. They used the Gospel of according to Matthew only, as we've already said. This is quoting from Irenaeus, and repudiate the Apostle Paul, maintaining that he was an apostate from the law. It's pretty difficult to hold to Orthodox Christianity if you think Paul got things wrong. As the prophetical writings, they endeavor to explain them in a somewhat similar, singular manner. They practice circumcision, persevere in the observance of the customs that are enjoined by the law, and so are Judaic in their style of life, and they even adore Jerusalem as if it were the house of God. So these were essentially much more Jewish than they were Christian, and may have been, again, some of the kinds of teachings and issues that the author to the New Testament book of Hebrews had to address. So you can see that maybe some of these ideas were very early. Again, more on from Irenaeus. He said, God then was made man, the Lord himself, and the Lord did himself save us, giving us the token of the Virgin, but not, as some allege, among those now presuming to expound the Scripture. He's speaking of the Ebionites. Behold, a young woman shall conceive and bring forth a son, as Theodotion the Ephesian has interpreted it, and Aquila of Pontus, both Jewish proselytes. These Ebionites assert that he was begotten by Joseph, thus destroying as far as in them lies such a marvelous dispensation of God, setting aside the testimony of the prophets which proceeded from God. In other words, heretics ruin everything. They think in terms of sort of rationalistic terms, and they have these other sort of notions denying the deity of Christ. So Irenaeus concludes, vain are the Ebionites who do not receive by faith into their soul the union of God and man, but who remain in the old leaven of the natural birth, and who do not choose to understand that the Holy Ghost came upon Mary, and the power of the Most High did overshadow her. Now, what's interesting about that is to note carefully, this is something that is going to be a big issue fairly shortly in the history of the church and church historical theology, that Irenaeus makes it very clear that he believes in the union of God and man. That is, that Christ was fully human and fully God. In some, the Ebionites denied that he was fully God. They saw him completely as a human. What we're going to see when we turn to the Gnostics is that they completely turned that around. They saw him as completely divine, and that anything that looked like he was completely human was either an image or a phantom, or, again, just seemed to be that way, but not really. Well, we'll see that in the next set of PowerPoints, the next video.